Some infectious diseases have the potential to be catastrophic and can take a life very quickly. Prion diseases are one of those, and they are 100% fatal. My name is Taylor Kuhn, and I'm going to be explaining a prion disease called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or also known as CJD. I wanted to cover a little bit of the history and discovery of prions and CJD. So to start, sheep scrapie was the first identified transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, also called TSE, also known as a prion disease. That was noted in 1732. So the first case of human TSE was CJD, which was discovered later, way later, in 1920 and 1921, when two neuroscientists known as Hans Creutzfeldt and Alfons Jakob had studied 6 autopsies with TSE patterns, and then they kind of started making this link. In 1959, a man named William Hadlow linked these other similarities, such as sheep scrapie and CJD and Kuru, which is another prion disease. Put those all together and started realizing that those were all very similar as well. So then finally in 1982, Stanley Prusiner had linked had actually made the discovery of prions and then labeled them as TSE diseases. And then discovered that CJD and sheep scrapie and all those things were these prion diseases. Today, we still don't know a whole lot. We don't have a lot of information about prions. It's just relatively not something that we have discovered or made too many advances on. Dementia and Alzheimer's are two things that they assume could be caused by prion diseases, but it's kind of very hard to know. And then covering the definition of prions and CJD. So a prion is a non-living infectious protein. They're essentially degenerative in nature, and they initiate the breakdown of their neurocytoplasm, and they work very, very quickly to do this. CJD actually has a life expectancy of anywhere from a couple of months up to 1 year. Typically, people don't make it past that 1 year mark. But when you look at an MRI or a brain scan, there's actually small little holes in the brain, and they link that appearance similar to Swiss cheese. When we're talking about CJD, there's 3 main types that they go over. So there's sporadic CJD. This is 85% of the cases, and this is just essentially tells us that we do not know the occurrence of the disease or why it was caused or why it was started. Hereditary CJD occurs in about 10 to 15% of cases. This is a gene mutation within the family, and there's 2 specific gene forms of CJD. There's GSS, which is extremely rare, and only 1 in 10 out of every 100 million worldwide have this genetic CJD. The second one is fatal familial insomnia. That's FFI. This one's even rarer than GSS. There's only been about 24 confirmed cases. And then there's acquired CJD. This is extremely rare. It's less than 1% of cases, and it typically happens from exposure during dural and corneal transplants. So transmission, there's indirect and direct transmission that I'm going to talk about, and then there is asymptomatic transmission. But when it comes to the case of CJD, this is exceptionally still unknown, as we discovered. But in the case of indirect transmission, this occurs when somebody touches something or comes into contact with something. Say they touch a doorknob and that has the germ, and then they contracted the illness or disease. CJD is not a case of this. And then there's also direct transmission, which occurs when a germ is spread through touching or kissing. And again, there's no evidence that CJD is contagious through saliva, respiratory droplets, sexual contact, anything like that. So when it comes to asymptomatic transmission as well, it's still very unclear, but there's not really any confirmed cases that this is, passed along through contact. And then, like I said in the previous slide, transmission can occur through transplants. So surgical instruments should be extremely sterilized, and surgeons should be very cautious when doing the procedure. One thing I had found interesting was in the 1998, there was 80 cases of healthcare associated CJD, which is probably from those things such as transplants, but 90% of those were dural transplants and only 10% were from corneal transplants. Talking about symptoms, there's a couple different symptoms that do mimic other diseases such as dementia or Alzheimer's or even some mental health disorders, but the two main symptoms they look at are severe mental deterioration and very rapid from the onset of those symptoms, and then involuntary muscle jerks or involuntary movements. Those other early symptoms include impaired memory or thinking, depression, mood swings, anxiety, unusual sensation, lack of coordination, balance problems, vision changes, confusion, insomnia, and the list goes on. So just a lot of more neurological symptoms that you would notice. And then taking a deeper dive, just discovering some virulence, high-risk populations, the incubation period and the latency period. So starting with the high-risk populations, it usually occurs in those who are ages 60 and up. There's very little to no known cases of CJD occurring in anyone under the age of 30 years old. And then also coroners and surgeons have a very small risk, like we discovered, or like I discussed during a procedure, they could potentially be exposed to it, but it's very rare that they would contract the disease. And then when it comes to virulence is the severity to which the infection caused by a prion, a virus, a bacteria can cause damage to its host. In the case of CJD, this disease is extremely virulent and is 100% fatal, and the progression can happen extremely quick. Like we mentioned earlier, the disease, once symptoms appear, the lifespan is within months up to 1 year. Incubation period is the time between exposure to an infection to the time symptoms develop. Like we said, we often don't know how or when the exposure occurred. So the incubation period could be up to 30 years. And then latency is the time between when a person is infected to when the individual can become infectious and spread the disease to other susceptible people. Also, no known transmission, so there typically isn't a latency period with this. When diagnosing CJD, there's certain things that they can do to essentially discover and diagnose the disease. So they can evaluate symptoms, evaluate the course of illness. They can do spinal fluid testing and MRI to look at brain scans or EEG and check out that electrical activity in the brain. Other things they can do are lab confirmation and discover the presence of protein 14-3-3 in the cerebrospinal fluid, or they could do a biopsy and do some brain tissue testing or a biopsy from an autopsy. And then moving on to prevention and treatment. Like I said, not much known about the disease, so it is unpreventable essentially. It's usually hereditary or the case is unknown, so we aren't able to really track that down and try to prevent the disease. So therefore, there's just no way to protect yourself against it. There's no treatment for this disease. Once the symptoms have occurred, the onset is very quick and the progression is rapid. Treatments such as pain medication, anxiety medication, all of those things can be used mostly for comfort. And then there's no vaccine. I did briefly read an article that they were trying to look up a form of treatment, but still nothing on vaccines. So no cure, no vaccine for this disease. Prevalence and epidemiology. So the prevalence is the number of cases of disease, or the number of existing cases of disease, and the incidence is the number of new cases of disease. So on the website below, I looked at prevalence. So they surveilled 34 countries from 1993 to 2020, and within this they had discovered that 350 new cases per year would occur in the US. So not very many cases, but like I said, this disease is kind of scary and a little progressive. And then say if we had 350 cases per year in all the countries and we times that by a 27-year span, that's about 9,400 total cases of death. So the prevalence it's very limited in the numbers, but it has been rising, especially as of late in the US. And then the epidemiology is 1.25 people per 1 million. And in 2016, we had a record high of 5 people per 1 million. So it is climbing a little bit. It went back down, and then now it seems to be ramping up a little bit more, but like I said, it's very hard to tell. So CJD, of course, is prevalent in different parts of the world, not just in the US, but they did do that surveillance in those 34 countries, and they listed the most amount of cases to the least amount of cases, and I will just go over the top 7 with you. So number 1 is the US, 2 is Germany, then France, then Italy, then China, then the UK, then Spain, and the list goes on from there. All right, and I just wanted to do a quick recap, and then I also wanted to just talk about a famous person who had a case of CJD. So Barbara Tarbuck actually passed at the age of 74 from CJD in 2013. She was an actress on General Hospital and MASH. But with that too, we'll do a quick recap and close out this presentation. So as we discussed, and I said several times, this is a prion disease and it is 100% fatal. There's those 3 main categories: the sporadic, the hereditary, and then those that can be contracted through transplants, which is very, very rare, so that acquired. There is no treatment, there's no cure. It can have an up to 30-year incubation period. And then we learned that our high-risk populations are 60 plus. It's important to note that we still do not know too much about prion diseases, so it is a little bit scary kind of living in the unknown of these diseases. But hopefully as scientists knowledge expand and as resources develop, we can start figuring out some more cures and preventative measures. And then lastly, this is my sources page, and I will be closing on this. Thank you for your time.